You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to another fine episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are here once again. As you see, I'm still in my office. This is still the rainy day recording that we're doing. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting back to my usual recording area, back to my cabin, but much too noisy out there today. So, so we're back for another episode here in our intermittent series on Creationism 101. Before we launch into that, I do want to remind you, go ahead and like this episode. We do appreciate that. Leave a comment if you like. We also appreciate that. Everything that we could do to, boost ourselves in the algorithm, we really appreciate that. Leave a review, share it with your friends, share it on social media. And thank you for all of that attention that you do give us. Even those of you who leave angry comments about how terrible we are doing this to children. Whatever. That helps too. Anyway. All right, back to Creationism 101. So remember in this series, Paul, we are trying to share, the most basic creationist interpretations of Genesis 1 through 11. We're trying to cut out the jargon as much as we can, avoid controversial stuff, disagreements. We acknowledge they exist, but we try not to make a big fuss about it. And we're just trying to focus here in this series on stuff that any creationist could listen to and hear and sort of nod along and say, yeah, that's pretty much how it is. So that's Creationism 101. That's what it's all about. Yeah. And we're back again for another installment.
Yeah, we are indeed. Regular viewers will know that in the last episode of this particular series, we left off with the descendants of Cain, and we briefly touched on the genealogy in genealogies in Genesis chapter 5.
We did.
So that's where we left off. Now, because we've got a whole nother series, which is all about biblical chronology, where we're looking in depth at Genesis 5 and 11 and those genealogies, we thought we would leave that particular discussion there. And so that means that we're moving on now to chapter 6 of Genesis. But there was one topic, I think, that we mentioned last time that we wanted to discuss, that we didn't cover last time. And that was the similarity of Cain's genealogy with Seth's genealogy. Now, this is a topic that I don't really hear a lot about in creationism. I'm not sure that it's particularly important or that there's very much to say. But, what can we say about this?
Yeah, I agree with you. This isn't something I hear a tremendous amount about. But, we gotta satisfy my obsessive compulsive disorder or whatever it is. My obsession for completion here. And at least mention this weirdness. So here we go. So as we saw in the previous episode, Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 22, lists the descendants of Cain. And those descendants in order are Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Lamech, and then Lamech's 4 kids, Jabal, Jubal, Tubal-Cain, and Naamah. Now, right away, 2 of those names should sound familiar to you, I think. We know Enoch in Genesis 5. He's the only one that didn't die. He walked with God, and God took him. That's all that it tells us. And then Lamech we know because Lamech is Noah's father in Genesis 5. So already we have 2 names that are just totally the same name as we find in Genesis 5, here in Genesis 4. But there's more, because when you start looking in more detail, if we look at the generations from Genesis 5, you might hear some things that sound a little familiar. So if we start with Seth's son, Seth has a son named Enosh, and then the next generation is Kenan, and then Mahalalel, and then Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. Now, I've heard critical scholars tell me that these two lists of names are so similar that they must have derived from the same source. So in other words, there used to be one list of names, and those names just got copied into a fake genealogy for Cain and then a fake genealogy for Seth. Because, the author was just making stuff up. That's how these myths are put together. So that's what this is. That's what the higher critical scholars would say. So obviously that interpretation is not very consistent with Christian theology on the authority and authenticity of the Word of God. So there it is. So that's the claim. There's a remarkable degree of similarity between Genesis 4 and Genesis 5.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what have creationists said about this? Because I'm not sure that I've heard much about it or read much about it at all.
No, I haven't heard much about it either. So there are other claims made by critical scholars that are a lot more outrageous, shall we say, and sound like a more direct attack on creationists. So they get a lot more attention. Things like, Genesis 2 contradicts Genesis 1. That really gets people all agitated. Now, I imagine somewhere some creationist has said something about this, but I don't know where. I guess if we dug hard enough, we would find somebody somewhere who had something to say about this. So I guess we'll just say, give our own take on this. Paul, do you have any thoughts of your own, maybe?
Well, let's think about these lists. So, as you said, two of the names are the same, Enoch and Lamech. And then looking at this list, I suppose that Irad is supposed to be similar to Jared. I suppose there's meant to be a kind of parallelism of some kind there. Perhaps Mehujael to Mahalalel, and Methushael to Methuselah. I assume those are the kind of the similarities that are being perceived here. But the order's all different, right?
Yeah.
So in Cain's line, we had Enoch, Irad, Mehujael, Methushael. And then in Seth's, we had Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, and then Methuselah. So, is that enough to say, these lists are kind of derived from the same list of names? I don't know. It seems somewhat tenuous to me. If you look at just the Genesis 5 genealogy, if you just look at that one alone, you've got two similar names there too. You've got Enosh and you've got Enoch.
Right.
And then if you just look at Cain's line, if you just look at the list, of Cain's descendants, you've got Mehujael and Methushael, which also are quite similar. So, can we make much of this? Can we make anything of this?
I don't know.
What do you think?
I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical of critical scholars in general, and I feel really skeptical on this point. Mostly because I'm not sure there's enough here to make a big fuss about. Enoch and Lamech definitely repeated, but names get repeated all the time in the Bible, right? Most prominently, this is one you don't get because it's a Greek and Hebrew difference, but Jesus is Joshua. Those are the same name, basically. So, names get repeated. So for me, I think what's more interesting here is the juxtaposition of Cain's genealogy and Seth's genealogy. I think putting them side by side in the text kind of puts a little spotlight right on Genesis 5, especially. Cain's genealogy is just a list, right? And there's names and there's little biographical details sort of randomly thrown in. But Seth's list is sort of full of sort of this chronological detail. You have that formula. This guy was this many years old when he begat his son. And after he begat his son, he lived so many years and his total lifespan was this much. And it kind of invites you to do the math when you're done and say, well, how long is this period of time here? And when you read through other Old Testament genealogies, they often follow the format that Cain's follows, right? For example, if you go over to First Chronicles, there you just have straight up lists of names. If you didn't know what they were, you wouldn't even know what you were reading. But we know, they're listing things like Seth, Enosh, and so forth. And so you can correlate them back to other genealogies. But otherwise, other biblical genealogies look a lot like Cain's. They follow the format of Cain's. And then generations get left out and so forth. So for me, I think the contrast of 4 with 5 is the really important point. It's like the text is trying to say, hey, pay attention to how different chapter 5 is, right?
Right.
You're going to read a lot of these genealogies in the Old Testament, but here's one that it's really going to stand out because it's really unusual and you should pay attention to that. I think I've talked about this before. I know I've talked about this in person with people, and I think it may have shown up in our biblical chronology series. So anyway, that's what I think. I don't think this is a big deal, but I think it's worth, mentioning there. So unless you got anything else to say, I think we'll move on to the next section.
I think we should move on. It doesn't seem a big deal to me.
Yeah, it's pretty tame. So all right. So we're skipping 5 because 5 is the subject of our chronology series. So people can go over and listen to that whole series. So then the next bit is the opening of Genesis 6, which is the subject of another fun episode we did. So it's the story of the Nephilim and the giants in the earth at the time that the sons of God married the daughters of men. And we did a whole episode called Giant Cannibal Babies. I would recommend that happily to our audience. Go check that out.
That's got to be the weirdest episode title we've ever had. So it'll be easy to find.
Indeed. It's got a good thumbnail too, where we're being eaten by a giant cannibal baby. All right. So go check that out. I don't think we need to repeat all that. Except just to point out that, there's not really, I think, a strong consensus on the identity of the sons of God and the daughters of men. I think there are, if there's a majority view, I would say it's probably that the sons of God are the descendants of Seth and the daughters of men are the descendants of Cain. But I think there are a lot of other individual creationists who are now starting to think there's something angelic going on with the sons of God. But, that view is also tainted by the giant cannibal baby stories in the extra biblical literature that tries to turn this brief account in Genesis 6 into some extravagant story of giant babies that eat everything in sight. Anyway.
Okay. So where do we go from there? Well, I mean, I would say, that's my experience. This is, there's a difference of opinion about this, but it's probably not a strong sort of division.
No.
Some people think that sons of God is an angelic term, that it refers to fallen angels. I have to say, I think that's probably my view.
Okay.
So I don't know, if that's the minority position, I think that's the one that I would tend to gravitate towards. But others say that, we're talking about the godly line of Seth and the wicked line of Cain.
Yep.
And there's a strong tradition, coming from that perspective too. And like you say, I think we can just refer our viewers, can't we, to previous episodes on that topic if they want to explore that a bit more.
Yeah. So that, I guess, brings us up to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, which begins the account of the flood. Sort of. So in this series, we're supposed to focus on the general beliefs of creationists. And every now and then we go off script a little bit to highlight an important issue that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention. I'm going to do that very briefly right here because I think we kind of need to talk about the odd style of the way the flood account is written. So at a first read through, you might notice a lot of odd repetition. Let's put it that way. It's as if the author is literally talking to you, right? And he's telling a story, and then maybe in the middle of the story, he thinks, oh yeah, I got to tell you this thing. So he backs up and sort of starts over and tells something in more detail. So listen to this passage in Genesis 6. I think this is a perfect illustration here. I'm reading from the King James here, starting in verse 6. It repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repents me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. So again, you have that pattern established, right? You have this, the narrator is telling the story, and then sort of pauses for a minute, backs up, and tells the same story again, only now adding detail. So the second time you read it, the first time you read it, God's just going to wipe everything out. And he specifically lists humans and land animals and creeping things and birds. Everything's going to get wiped out. And then the rewind is, oh, by the way, there was a guy named Noah. And God told Noah, oh, you need to build an ark, and we're going to put you in the ark and the animals, and that's eventually what's going to happen there. But the idea is that you rewind and there's this added detail. So what in the world is going on here? And that's pretty much how the whole flood story proceeds. It's why it ends up being a subject of a lot of creationist writing, trying to sort out exactly like the chronology of the flood, what's the order of events, and so forth. Because it's got this strange pattern, strange style. And part of the answer, it's not the whole answer, but part of the answer to the weird style is a deliberate literary form of writing called a chiasm. It's also called a palistrophy. Now, this is going to be hard to explain without a visual aid, but we will link to an article in the show notes that will have this all outlined for you so you can look at it yourself. But chiasm is basically a form of composition in Hebrew writing, and there are multiple examples in the Old Testament of chiasms. This is by far the largest of those structures, and it's a kind of parallelism, but it's a special kind where, usually in Hebrew poetry, you get couplets, 2 lines, one right after the other, that essentially say the same thing, but in different words. That's the classic synonymous parallelism form, okay? Well, in a chiasm, the parallelism does not go like immediately juxtaposed like that. Instead, the parallel lines are arranged in a nested pattern.
Mm.
And what do I mean by that? I mean that once you have the whole chiasm laid out, you'll find that the first line matches the last line. And the second line matches the second to the last one. And the third line matches the third to the last one, and so forth. So the parallel, you don't really understand that you're reading a chiasm until you kind of get to the end and you realize, oh, look at that. You kind of have to sit down and look at it to really recognize that you have that first, last, second to last, second to next to last sort of pattern. And the point of the chiasm is the central idea. And it can be a pair of lines in the middle that are parallel, or it can be a single central standalone line. And in the flood chiasm, the central point is chapter 8, verse 1, God remembered Noah. That is the central point. So you might remember when we interviewed Dustin Burlett about his book on the flood. We will put a link to that episode in the show notes. He argued that God's salvation is really the point of the story. He said, if you look at the flood story, the focus is not on the disaster so much as it is on God's deliverance of people through the disaster. It's God's salvation. And the chiasm totally supports that. God remembered Noah, right? Here's salvation for the righteous. And then the chiasm also kind of helps us understand or put into context here why you have such a funny way of telling the story. Why does it sound like an old man trying to ramble his way through this story and keeps rewinding and telling you more detail? The reason is there is this nested structure. So that's literally what's happening. There is a nested structure where you have a story that's like a bunch of nested parentheses, and they're just putting these little stories in the middle, and it all focuses your attention on God remembering Noah. And as I said, we will absolutely put a link to Gordon Wenham's article way back, I think in the 70s, where he pointed this out and lays out for us that structure. So you can check it out for yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think you explained actually, quite a complex subject there quite well.
I hope so.
Without a visual aid, because it's actually quite hard to explain what a chiasm is without seeing it visually kind of laid out for you. But no, that was very helpful. And I mean, one other comment is for those people who want to say Genesis 6 verses 5 to 8 is not part of this big chiasm that you're talking about, because that's Genesis 6 5 to 9, because that starts at verse 10, and therefore the repetition there is not explained by the chiasm. I think we would say that it does explain it, because it introduces this big chiasm, right? The closing statement in Genesis 6 and verse 8 is that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Right? Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And of course, that raises a question. It kind of leaves the author wondering, what does that mean? How did that happen? And then that sort of leads into this big chiasm, right? So, I think it does sort of make sense, even of those verses. I mean, incidentally, I'm no expert. I don't know, but it strikes me that this chiastic structure, the fact that the whole flood account is this sort of big chiasm, could be seen as evidence against the higher critical perspective, which says that the flood account, and indeed, the book of Genesis as a whole, is actually the result of multiple conflicting independent accounts that have sort of been clumsily stitched together into one narrative. And when you come to a passage like this, where you have the flood account and you see this bit, the way it's structured as this big chiasm, that suggests that this whole account is a coherent, harmonious unit to me. that would be extremely unexpected if this was just a whole load of independent accounts that's sort of been stitched together.
That's right.
But anyway, that's kind of by the by. I'm no expert. I don't know, but that's just something that occurred to me. Okay, well, I mean, there's a lot here that creationists have a lot to say about. So let's sort of dig into some of that. One of the things I want to sort of draw listeners' attention to is in this passage, God determines to destroy both man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air. Okay, so that's Genesis 6 and verse 7. And then in chapter 6 and verse 13, we have God telling Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me. For the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And I think this is pretty clear as the first indication that this destruction is not intended to be understood as a local destruction. Okay, we've got man and beast, creeping thing, fowl of the air, and that is equated with all flesh. This flood that's coming is going to destroy every creature on the land.
Right.
Okay, that's what all flesh means in this passage, in this context. And that has the implication that the flood is not just coming to the parts of the world that are inhabited by humans, but to everywhere that you find terrestrial animals living on the land. So to me, this is this first indication that this is worldwide. This is universal in extent. This is not just what we might say anthropologically universal, affecting only humans. This is universal in the sense of wherever animals are living.
Yeah. And we're emphasizing this because, of course, that's the response, right? If you're a Christian who does want to take the Bible seriously, but you're very worried about, science says there's no evidence of the flood, then an easy way out might be to say, well, maybe this is just a really big flood that wiped out all the people, but it's not really a global flood. So the details are all real, but there's some exaggeration. There's some hyperbole happening in the text. Yeah, I'm not sure that's going to work. I think there's a lot of detail here that is sort of like a flashing neon sign saying it's global, it covered the whole world. So in verse 13, again, God says, I will destroy all flesh with the earth, right? So along with the earth, everything is going to be destroyed. So, I hear these individuals trying to tell us that this is a local inundation, like a big river or whatever. I've even heard people say, this might be a glacial flood, like the Missoula flood. If you guys in the audience don't know about the Missoula flood, you should look that up. It's pretty cool, pretty good story. But, I don't know how to reconcile that with the details. And I don't think we're nitpicking here about one word. We're going to see this pattern repeated over and over again as we go through this passage. It's going to be a broken record. You're going to be tired of hearing us say, oh, this is another indication that it's a global flood, because there's so many of them. Yeah. So, yeah.
There are going to be, as you say, lots more indications of the universality of the flood. And we're going to talk about those as we come to them. So that's definitely something we will cover. The next big thing, though, that we see here is the description of the ark. So why don't we read that description? So you find it in Genesis 6, verses 14 to 16. And again, reading from the Authorized Version. Make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above, And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. Now, I mean, that's a pretty succinct description of the ark.
Yeah.
There's not a huge amount to the description. Some of it actually isn't even terribly clear. For example, gopher wood, make thee an ark of gopher wood. We don't know what gopher wood was.
Yeah.
And people have different ideas. I mean, was it a particular type of wood? Was it a particular kind of treatment that was applied to the wood? Yeah. We don't know. We don't know. It is just a transliteration of the original Hebrew word, kopher. And it was kept as a transliteration, presumably, because it wasn't clear what it referred to in English. So we don't know. So that's unclear. And then there's this curious statement about in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And again, the Hebrew here is really quite obscure. I think most creationists have sort of come to the conclusion today that there was perhaps a 1 cubit wide opening sort of under the roof overhang of the ark. I'm not sure there's a lot of strong opinion about that, but that tends to be, I think, how many people think about it. It has been understood differently, I think, in the past. Some quite different views about what that means, but it's not clear. So we have this very succinct and in some respects unclear description of the construction of the ark. Cubits. I mean, cubits also.
Yeah.
What kind of cubit are we talking about here? And again, there might be some disagreement about that. Exactly how long the cubit was that was used to construct the ark. And so you'll read in the creationist literature, people come up with different dimensions for the ark, depending on which cubit they're using and that kind of thing. So there are some uncertainty. You may recall that way back in episode 68, Todd, we actually covered the construction and capacity of the ark. We did a whole episode about that.
Mm-hmm.
And people should definitely go and check that out. We came to the conclusion, thinking about this, that the ark had more than enough room for all of the representatives of the kinds of animals and birds that were taken on board the ark, room for Noah and his family and for all of the foodstuffs that they had to take on board, all of that kind of stuff. But if you want those sort of details, we will refer you to that episode. Again, we'll put a link in the show notes. We won't repeat all of that here. It's quite a complicated subject. There's lots of aspects to it. And we probably covered that better in that episode than we can do in a few minutes in this episode. So episode 68, construction and capacity of the ark. Okay, where do we go from here?
Right, we're referring to a lot of past episodes for this episode. Giant Cannibal babies, biblical chronology series, building of Noah's Ark. They're all relevant, but as you say, we got time, we got limited time, and we gotta move on to the next big subject. So one other thing that I think we can point out here that I think is important, I'm going to bang on this drum again, is the massive capacity of the ark, right? So you mentioned God's determination to wipe out all flesh, human and land animals, that was confirmation that we should read this as a universal or a worldwide, a global disaster. And the massive scale of the ark confirms that the author here was clearly thinking, this, I mean, if you think of it as an author, let's clarify this. If you think of it as an author just making up a story, then the size of the ark is clearly huge. And the author was thinking, I need a lot of room if I'm going to put in all the animals. Now, I don't think that's what happened. But even if you're a critical scholar, it's pretty clear the author here thinks this flood covered everything that they knew that the world was at that time. So, and if you think that it's an authoritative revelation of the history of the world, like I do, then the capacity of the ark is even better, because why would you Why would you build a giant ark for a local flood? Why not just move?
Yeah, exactly. If the flood is only local, you don't need a boat at all. You can just move. You can just go to the next river valley, or you could even move a long way, because we know, as we'll see when we get into the chronology of the flood, God gave Noah at least a century's forward notice of the flood coming. Noah had loads of lead time, to move a long distance if he needed to.
Yeah.
To escape this flood. But that's, of course, not what happened. So the whole notion of an ark this big, with so much space for the animals and all the provisions and so on, that tells us, I think, that this is not an ordinary river flood. The ark is not a little coracle on the river. That is not what's being described here. Or even a bigger flood, like you say, sort of a big glacial flood, or the flooding of the Black Sea, or something like that. That is not what's being described. This is something that you cannot escape from unless you take representatives of all of the animals with you on the earth, all of the animals and birds as well.
Yep.
Birds can escape a local flood relatively easily. They can fly.
Yeah.
It's just over and over again in so many ways.
Yeah.
This passage is telling us that the flood destroyed the whole world.
Yep. So if you think this was just made up by some author, then the author clearly thinks this flood was covering and destroying everything. And if you think this is God's revelation, then the details here make no sense if God is just going to destroy one location where the people live. All right, so let's expand that theme a little more here. As I said, everyone's going to get tired of hearing about how this is a global flood, but it is, yeah. All right, so here's what it says. God describes, after describing the ark, God says this, verse 17 in chapter 6. Behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die. Now, we said the chiasm explains some of the repetition in this passage, but it's also here for emphasis, right? Because remember, I think we've mentioned this before on the show, Hebrew doesn't have adverbs like we have in English, right? So if they need to emphasize something, they repeat it, right? So classic example in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, the threat of death from God is literally in the Hebrew, you will die. So you're going to be really dead. That's the idea. So here we have a case of more repetition. Why is the flood coming? It's to destroy all flesh under heaven. Everything in the earth will die. Everything, everywhere. In the English, that sounds like two different descriptions, and it kind of is, but the words all and every in Hebrew actually translate the same Hebrew word. So it's again being repeated for emphasis. All things. All things. Every all thing is going to die. Everything is going to die. That's how you should kind of think about this. So again, we have another reason to sort of accept and affirm this is a global disaster. It's a global catastrophe because everything under the whole heaven will be destroyed. Everything. All right, and then there's one more reason in this verse. The idea of a flood occurs in other passages in the Old Testament. It's mentioned in other places, right? And they use at least two Hebrew words. One is shetep, which is related to the verb for washing, and another is nahar, which is just a word for river. And obviously, nahar would recall the idea of a river overflowing its banks and raging out of its normal course and being destructive. Here in Genesis, then, we're introduced to a totally different word. that, as far as I can tell, is only ever used for this one flood. That word is Mabul. So even the language here, the choice of words that are used to describe this flood, it seems to be deliberately avoiding words that could be understood to be the kind of river flooding that people would be accustomed to. This Babul, whatever it is something entirely different. So, and I would understand it then, given, the universality of these other terms and descriptions. It's another one of those things that suggests that this is bigger than just Nahar or Shetep, those kind of overflowing river floods. This is something bigger.
Yeah.
Mabul is bigger.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that this unique word is used. I think I'm right in saying it's the same in the New Testament, that a unique word is used to refer to the flood, from which we get our word cataclysm.
Yeah.
So, do we know anything about the meaning of the word Mabul?
Since it's only ever used for the one event, it's really hard to know the meaning, right? Because you derive meaning from usage when you see how words are used. And it's only used 13 times in the Old Testament anyway. So it's hard to know. I mean, I reading through concordances for this episode, I saw one that suggested the Mabul was related to a verb that means to carry off or to bear away, which would make sense in this sense, because in this context, because that's exactly what the Mabul is for. But obviously I don't know. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I don't know about all the intimate details of Hebrew terminology and words and so forth, but that's what I was told. Mabul is related to something meaning to carry away.
Yeah. Anyway, whatever it means, it's a unique word.
Yep.
It's the incomparable flood, the incomparable catastrophe. This is not just a river flood. This is not a little local inundation. This is something much, much different. Okay, so we come towards the close of this chapter, and the chapter closes with instructions for what Noah should do with the ark. And interestingly, again, there's another sort of theme here, which is interesting in these in this account, which is the first hint. We get the first hint that the flood is being portrayed as another creation. That the flood is sort of the undoing of creation.
Yeah.
It's an uncreation event. And then the flood brings about a new world and a new creation. And we're going to see this, I think, especially when we get to chapter 8. So we'll talk about it some more when we get there. But for now, just take note that Noah is told in this passage to bring 2 of every kind of land animal and bird onto the ark. And that is exactly parallel to what we see in Genesis chapter 1, when God creates the living creatures after their kind. So there's this relationship between Genesis 1 and the flood account. Now, when we covered Genesis 1 in this series, we didn't really try to define that phrase, after their kind. It's not used that often in Scripture. It's used here in the flood account. It's used in the creation account. It turns up as well in the kosher food lists in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. But like Mabul, after its kind is one of those sort of phrases, words that has a kind of uncertain meaning. I think here in the context of the flood, you sort of get the impression that after its kind means more than just all sorts of or every variety of. But whatever, precisely it means, it definitely refers to the ancestors of the modern land animals and birds that were preserved on the ark. And regardless of exactly how that phrase is being used, precisely how we define it, the fact that both Genesis 1 and the flood account both refer to the animals with this phrase, after its kind, according to its kind, I think is a signal that we should recognize there is a connection, there is a relationship between these two passages. Now, we're going to talk about this some more when we get to chapter 8, but for now, let's just kind of content ourselves with pointing out that there appears to be a relationship here, that we're getting this message that the flood is a kind of another creation, an uncreation and a new creation. And it's being underlined by this similarity that is this relationship that's being drawn with Genesis chapter 1, as well as, of course, as you've already pointed out earlier in the episode, all of the repetition for emphasis and the big chiasm. There is this relationship between Genesis 1 and the flood account.
Yeah.
So
it's in
those are just a few.
Yeah, it's an amazing passage, right? I mean, you've got the literary structure going on. You've got repetition for emphasis going on. You've got now deliberately weaving connections with Genesis 1 going on.
Yeah.
And as we'll see, you mentioned Genesis 8. That's where it really starts to show up, because the order that things happen in chapter 8 parallels the order that things are happening in chapter 1, which is
absolutely
pretty wild. So we'll obviously get into more detail about that when we get there. But you're right. Yeah. So again, let's just rewind here and think about, what we talked about with the critical scholars, talking about how, these stories are all patched together from different sources and sort of sloppily put together so that, it's all contradictory and it doesn't make any sense. I don't know how you do that with the flood account, right? Because the flood account is astonishing. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And clearly a very thoughtful, careful author composed that passage. It's not something that's sort of slapped together and stitched together and has the scars of multiple totally independent authors. Somebody had to sit down and order this out very carefully in their mind before they started writing, in order to make the whole thing cohere in that way and tell a consistent story. So that really does make me awfully skeptical of people and their higher critical perspective on this.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anything else to say? I think we've reached the end of chapter 6, and that seems like a good stopping point. Just remind folks, all the other episodes we talked about in this episode, the biblical chronology series. If you're interested in more information on Genesis 5, consult that. If you're interested in what we think about the Nephilim and the sons of God and the daughters of men, you can consult our episode, Giant Cannibal Babies, which we will provide that link in the show notes. Noah's Ark and its construction and capacity. Go ahead, and there's a whole episode that we did on that. And we haven't done a lot on the connection between the flood and creation. That seems like it could be its own episode.
We should do that.
Yeah, we should probably do that, because there's another new creation, right? So if the flood is a new creation, there's another new creation that is yet to come, that is yet to happen. And that has implications for all of this.
Yes, indeed.
So the way the flood recreates the world, the way creation happened in the beginning, and the way God is going to recreate everything in the end. Yeah, very connected. All right. Well, anyway, I don't want to get too rambly here. Thank you for listening. As always, recall that we are a listener-supported ministry. We do depend on donations to Biblical Creation Trust and to Core Academy of Science to make this podcast possible. It is an expensive podcast to produce. I estimated the cost a couple years ago, about $600 an episode. It's probably a little higher than that now, just due to economic conditions. You guys know what I'm talking about. the economy, right? It's terrible. So yeah, we do depend on your donations. We would very much appreciate it if you'd visit letstalkcreation.org and find out how you can be a partner of the ministry. If you would like to sponsor an episode, we would be very happy to talk with you about that as well. About $600, you can suggest a topic that we would probably work with you on developing into an actual episode. We've had a lot of good episodes from sponsors. So if you've sponsored one in the past, thank you very much. I hope you'll consider that in the future. Again, maybe. Anyway, like and subscribe, do all the social media jazz, help us beat the evil algorithm that wants to keep us in security. Do share with your friends, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.